All right, on Wednesday, we left off talking about digestion. We happened to make our way actually all the way through the small intestine and talking about the various enzymes that aid in digestion of carbs, lipids, and proteins. And we also had our running tally of enzymes that came from our saliva, from our stomach, from our pancreas, and then we've even added in a couple other, not enzymes, but hydrochloric acid from our stomach for breakdown of proteins, and bio, which helps to emulsify fats. What we've accomplished at this point is broken things down into as simple as we need to prep us for absorption. And this is the whole reason why we eat, to provide the nutrients that our body needs, which includes those fuel nutrients, carbs, lipids, and proteins, but also water, vitamins, and minerals, which are regulatory in nature. So we will talk a little bit about absorption of those things as well. What absorption is, it's the passage of substances through the intestinal mucosa into our blood or into our lymphatic system. This is going to occur by way of diffusion, simple diffusion that is, where stuff can pass directly through the plasma membrane, through facilitated diffusion where it goes down its gradient but needs a protein to carry it, osmosis, which we know is the diffusion of water, and then active transport, which should indicate to us that ATP is required. Okay. Let's first talk about carbs. Okay. We absorb carbs in the form of monosaccharides, which includes glucose, galactose, and fructose. Okay. We don't absorb everything, as we talked about the other day. There are undigestible carbohydrates like cellulose and fiber that will get lost out through feces. Okay. But let's talk about the absorption of glucose, galactose, and fructose, our three monosaccharides. Fructose is different from the other two. It's absorbed by way of just straight up facilitated diffusion. You can see that at the bottom of this page. Fructose by itself carried in by way of a protein transporter. Okay. Glucose and galactose have to take a piggyback ride. They hop on, or hitch a ride, there's the word I'm looking for, with sodium. Sodium gives a piggyback ride to allow those two things into our cell by way of secondary active transport. So ATP is not used directly here. It's an indirect process. But both of those are brought in. Now, all three are then taken from the absorptive cell into our blood just by straight up facilitated diffusion. You can see that again here on the next page with a little bit bigger of an image, and it shows directly where they're going, which is our blood. Okay. Proteins, most of those are absorbed as amino acids by way of active transports. We have different transporters that carry the different types of amino acids, some in a similar way to glucose, while others are actively transported by themselves. Okay. We can see that down here. Amino acids, secondary active transport with sodium, which is just like glucose and galactose, or just transported with facilitated diffusion. Now, we can also absorb dipeptides and tripeptides, which are 2 and 3 amino acids in length. Okay. Both of those, dis and tris, are absorbed by secondary active transport, but this time, hydrogen ion gives the piggyback ride. Now, when those dis and tris make their way into the absorptive cells, they're then split into single amino acids, because then the single amino acid can be absorbed by facilitated diffusion, and as it shows it here, it goes into the blood. Okay. Fats are the most complex. Even though they can travel directly through the plasma membrane, because remember the plasma membrane is primarily made up of phospholipids, which are a form of fat, and fats don't have problems going through other fats, which we're using simple diffusion here. It's a fairly complicated process that involves some kind of taxis or ferries bringing stuff into the cell and then out of the cell. Okay. Now, that's the case for the long-chain fatty acids and monoglycerides. Okay. Short-chain fatty acids can just directly go in by simple diffusion. Long-chain fatty acids and monoglycerides use what's called a micelle. We can see a micelle down here in our image on the right. Is the fatty acids and the glycerols surrounded by biosalts. They pull the fats in those forms into our absorptive cells. Now, once in our absorptive cells, those fatty acids and monoglycerides combine to form triglycerides, which then become surrounded by what's called a chylomicron. Chylomicrons then leave the absorptive cells by way of exocytosis, and instead of entering to the blood, they enter into our lymphatic system. We talked about this a few weeks ago. Within each one of those little finger-like villi, you have blood, as you can see here, an arterial, a venular, and a capillary, but you've also got these what we call lacteals, and that's where the fats go. Okay. Now, eventually those fats will make their way and get dumped into the bloodstream, okay, but they don't get dumped directly into the blood like your carbs and your proteins do, or your amino acids, I should say. Now, we talked the other day that our liver is where we do the metabolizing of carbs and fats and proteins. The great thing is after we've absorbed carbs and amino acids, the blood is routed right to our liver by way of a portal vein. That way they can be basically directly carried to the liver. Okay, remember portal vein, we talked about the hepatic portal, or the hypophyseal portal veins that connected our hypothalamus to our anterior pituitary. Same concept here, this time we're carrying nutrients. Okay. Other things that we absorb include electrolytes. Electrolytes like sodium and potassium, chloride, they're all ions. We absorb those from our GI secretions, so some of our GI secretions contain those things, okay, like hydrogen ion and chloride ion, like an HCl here, hydrochloric acid. The rest of the electrolytes that we absorb are just from our food and liquids. Sodium is absorbed by the sodium-potassium ATPase pump into our blood, after it's moved into absorptive cells by diffusion and secondary active transport, like we were just showing back here. Okay. Now, back at the earlier part of the semester, we learned what happens when you drink salt water. Your body becomes dehydrated, right? Because your water is going to flow out of your cells to the place where salt is. Because water always chases after electrolytes, like sodium, potassium, chloride, okay, which if you combine sodium and chloride, you form salt. So water, as it states here, is dependent on the absorption of electrolytes, and we absorb water in our small intestine by osmosis. Okay. Most of our water is absorbed in our small intestine, as we'll see in the next couple slides. Some of it's actually absorbed in our large intestine. Okay. And then vitamins, which we can classify as either fat-soluble or water-soluble. Water-soluble absorbed or are absorbed by simple diffusion, whereas fat-soluble are absorbed just like fats were by way of those micelles, and so on and so forth. Questions on absorption? Pretty complicated, but something that's absolutely essential for us to survive. Table 24.4 is just summarizing all the various activities that we've just recently talked about today and on Wednesday. Includes the 3 accessory organs associated with the small intestine, our liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. What they all do, produce various chemicals that are dumped in the small intestine, and then our small intestine is where most of the magic happens, both digestion and absorption. That leaves us with one last segment of the intestines, what we call the large intestine, very terminal portion of our tract, approximately only a length of 1.5 to 1.8 meters. So it's shorter, much shorter than our small intestine, but it's much wider. about twice as wide, and that's why it's called the large intestine. Two parts to it. You have a cecum, which is down in our lower right quadrant. It's actually open here so you can see inside of it. This is what receives chyme from the small intestine through what's called the ileocecal sphincter. Okay. Your cecum is basically just a pouch that goes nowhere. Okay. Off of its your appendix. Not really that important. The majority of your large intestine is what we call the colon. Includes an ascending, a transverse, a descending, a sigmoid, and then a rectal region. Okay. Now, making up those various regions are these little kind of pouches, as you can see hopefully in our image, which are called haustra. And we'll talk about the importance of haustra on the next page. They're important for digestion purposes. Overall, our large intestine completes absorption. It does produce certain vitamins, and we'll see why here on the next page. And then ultimately it forms feces that then can be expelled, which is, what we call pooping. Something very important, really could say some things if I wanted to. In our large intestine, we have what we call intestinal or gut microbiota. These are bacteria that provide us, their host, with several benefits. They actually produce vitamin K and folic acid, which then can be absorbed across the wall of our large intestine. Produce short-chain fatty acids, which can be used for energy by cells of our colon and aid in the absorption of different materials. And then they also prevent accumulation of other bacteria, which is done by promoting anti-inflammatory processes. Their major function can be discussed down here with their role in chemical digestion. Okay. Our large intestine doesn't actually produce any enzymes. Okay. There is no lipase or amylase here. Okay. What we do is prep chyme for elimination by fermentation of materials of our food by the bacteria. Okay. Fermentation is a process that we're going to talk about in our next lecture. But as a result of fermentation, methane gas is produced. And that's where flatulence or farts come from. Okay. What bacteria can do is break down carbs. So things that have a lot of carbs in them, we're getting carbs to be gassy, like refried beans and that kind of stuff. They also can break down any remaining portion or proteins into amino acids. They also break down or decompose bilirubin, which is something that came from hemoglobin. It forms stercobilin, which is what gives your feces its typical brown color. So that's chemical digestion. Okay. Mechanical digestion involves those haustra, those individual little pouches. And as we move the chyme along the length of our large intestine, we basically churn it within each of those haustra and then pass it from haustra to haustra. And so it gets churned and then passed, and then churned and then passed, all the way down the large intestine. Okay. So that helps with mechanical digestion. Okay. That's a form of motility. So is peristalsis, as we know. Okay. This occurs in our large intestine, but at a much slower rate than in the proximal portions of our tract. There's a final movement that occurs, and this is called mass movement. Strong wave of contraction beginning at the middle part of our transverse colon, and then quickly drives the contents of our colon into our rectum. Mass movement is similar to peristalsis, except that the contractions last for a longer period of time. Mass movement usually takes place 3 to 4 times a day during or immediately after a meal. Hence, the presence of food in the stomach will trigger mass movement in the large intestine, an event what we call the gastrocolic reflex. Basically, this is why you have to go to the bathroom after you've eaten a meal. When food hits your stomach, it activates this reflex and pushes food along, your large intestine, and at that point you might have the urge to go. This is why people like to think, oh man, that ran right through me 30 minutes after they got done eating. Okay. They don't know what they're talking about. What's coming out or wanting to come out is last night's meal or earlier in the day's meal. Okay. And then finally, last thing I want to mention is that any remaining water not absorbed by our small intestine is absorbed in our large intestine. Along with it are various electrolytes, sodium, potassium, hydrogen, chloride. Most of what we absorb takes place in the small intestine, and very little bit in our stomach, as we mentioned. Really, by the time we reach the rectum, it's all feces and nothing's being absorbed. And at that point, it's feces, which needs to be eliminated through the process called defecation. Defecation reflex is what controls this process. It's a very coordinated process. The figure on the right describes how it works. It involves stretch-sensitive receptors in the rectal mucosa. Okay. When the rectum is empty, those stretch receptors are not going to be activated. Okay, makes sense. They're only activated when the rectum stretches. Okay. If you look here in the figure, we see that in our stage 1 here, with the rectum empty, our external anal sphincter is relaxed and our internal anal sphincter is contracted. Those two things, or muscles, guard the opening, what we call our anus. Okay. Your external is actually under voluntary control once you become potty trained, or poop trained if you want to be more specific here. Your internal is made up of smooth muscle and it's involuntarily controlled. Okay. When that rectum fills, a reflex occurs, ultimately causing your external to be contracted and your internal to be relaxed. At this point, you're going to have the urge to go, but if it's not timely, you're going to hold it, hopefully, right? Because you can voluntarily keep your anus closed. When we do go, and it's timely, both of those will be relaxed. Well, that's not going to just cause everything to drop out. To push it out, we're going to have contractions of the rectal wall. Other parts of the large intestine will also contract. Your ab muscles will help push things down as well, because they will push in on the wall of the rectum and the sigmoid colon. Okay. To even further provide pressure, we can perform a Valsalva maneuver. Okay. You don't have to necessarily be pooping to perform this maneuver. Okay. This is where you can hold your breath and like blow out, but not actually blow out. Okay. So push real hard, but not exhale, basically. Okay. I do want you to know those steps over there. Now, 2 conditions are listed here. We're all very aware of these. Constipation is where basically stuff gets moved too slow and we absorb too much water, and so it gets real hard, our stool that is, versus diarrhea where things get moved too fast, motility is too high, therefore we don't absorb enough water and electrolytes, and it's really watery. Any questions?